Pay more than £2 million worth of fines issued to hauliers after migrants were found hiding in their vehicles has gone unpaid. The Home Affairs Select Committee says £6.5 million worth of fines were issued between 2014 and 2015, but of that, just over £4 million was received, so just over £2 million wasn't. Simon Clarke is a barrister and a road transport expert, and he's on the line now. Morning, Simon.
Good morning.
Does this surprise you, first of all?
The unpaid fines section doesn't surprise me, but you have to look at the whole thing in context. Of the 2.25 million trucks that come into the UK a year, the 3,300 penalty represents less than half of 1% of those trucks being fined. So the suggestion that it's a huge problem has to be looked at in that context.
Yes, but so yeah, I get that. But the fact is that if you are issuing fines, it's a civil offence, I understand. And does that make it more difficult to enforce?
It does, for two reasons. First of all, most of the fines are levied against European hauliers, and particularly Eastern European hauliers, and the way to avoid a fine for them is simply not to come back. And secondly, in any event, if you want to enforce a fine, you have to do it through the civil courts, which is a lengthy and can be an expensive process.
Yeah, so it's not a case of issuing the fine and then if they don't pay it the next time they come in the country, you could arrest them, could you?
No, sadly not, because it's not a criminal offence.
Not a criminal offence. Do you think it would help if it were made a criminal offence?
Well, it's a couple of hundred years since we started sending people to debtors' prisons for not paying civil debt, so I don't really see that happening.
Okay. So how complicated is it to pursue a Europe or an Eastern or any European truck driver then?
Well, there are two categories of truck driver and owners. The Western European, the French, the Germans, the Belgians, the Dutch, etc., who are generally fairly reputable and pay the fines when they're imposed. You have to remember these are penalties, not fines, and they're imposed where there is no evidence that the driver or the owner knew that the immigrants were in there. That's the whole point.
And is it? Well, that's interesting. Just before we go on, I mean, how sort of flexible are they on that? Because I mean, most drivers would say, "I didn't know they were in there."
Well, there's a Home Office code of conduct which hauliers are supposed to follow, and it involves the establishment of security systems and regular checks and the recording of those regular checks. And so if a customs or a border agency officer stops you and you don't have these checks in place and there are immigrants, then you've been careless in the way you look after your vehicle. That's very different from the proposition that you knew they were in there and therefore you were committing the criminal offence of people smuggling. And these fines were introduced according to the parliamentary Hansard comment, to encourage otherwise innocent hauliers to look after their vehicles better to prevent the problem. But going back to the original point that I was mentioning, the second category of European hauliers are those that hail from Eastern Europe. And they are very, very poorly paid. I've seen salaries of less than £1,500 per month on the euro equivalent. And these guys, when they get stopped and fines are imposed against them, simply don't come back to the UK, and so enforcement is impossible.
Right. But even if they did come back, what could you do?
Same answer. It's a civil debt, and you have to pursue them through the civil courts. But one interesting feature of the fines is that the legislation makes the owner of the vehicle liable for the driver's fine if the driver doesn't pay.
Okay.
So it all falls back on the owner.
Now, tell me this, Simon. If I was a truck driver and I came to Calais and I went, and as I understand, you can go to the authorities and say, "Can you just check my truck with their probes and all that?" And if I did that, and let's say they said, "No, you're clear," and when I got to Dover, I found I wasn't, would that be good enough mitigation to not get a fine? For instance,
well, sadly, it wouldn't be relevant. What the people at Dover would look at would be what sort of security you had installed in your vehicle. So you're back to have you conducted regular checks.
So even if you've asked somebody to check it and they've not found anything, but there was someone in there, it's your fault.
It's your fault if you don't have the necessary checks in place. And I have cases where precisely that event has happened.
Really? Because that seems extraordinary to me, because, they're doing their best to find these people by going to the authorities and said, "Can you check my truck?" Nothing's been found, and then they're found guilty.
Yeah, well, exactly so. I have a Western European haulier who, because he had technology on his truck, reported to the French authorities that he believed somebody might have got in. They checked him, couldn't find anybody, sent him on through the tunnel to Dover where people were found, and he was fined.
I think people will find that amazing that can happen, but there you go. You know best. Simon Clarke, thank you very much indeed. Simon Clarke, a barrister and road transport expert on those unpaid fines. We did ask to speak to the Home Office Minister this morning. Our request was declined. We're still awaiting a statement from them.
25 minutes to 9 on BBC Radio Canberra.